Tommy Briggs had been fixing cars for 23 years, and he thought he'd seen just about everything. Broken transmissions, blown engines, cars that had been driven into ditches, you name it. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to stumble upon on that cold Thursday evening in November. It was around 7:30 when Tommy finally locked up his small repair shop on the edge of town. He was tired, covered in grease, and looking forward to getting home to a hot meal in his favorite chair. The day had been long, filled with one problem after another. First, old Mrs. Henderson's sedan needed a complete brake replacement. Then the Miller kid brought in his truck with what turned out to be a cracked engine block. By the time Tommy cleaned up and headed out, the sun had already set, and darkness had swallowed up the rural roads that connected his shop to his house 15 miles away. Tommy's own truck, a reliable Ford that he'd maintained himself for the past decade, had never given him trouble. Which is why he was so surprised when, about 5 miles from home, the engine started making a strange knocking sound. Then it got worse. The whole vehicle began shuddering, and before he could even pull over properly, the engine died completely. He coasted to the shoulder of the narrow forest road and sat there for a moment in the sudden silence, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine. He tried turning the key a few times, but nothing happened. Not even a click. Tommy sighed heavily and grabbed his flashlight from under the seat. He popped the hood and took a look, but in the dim beam of his flashlight, he couldn't see anything obviously wrong. He'd have to call for a tow, but when he pulled out his phone, his heart sank. No signal, not even one bar. This particular stretch of road cut through dense forest, and cell reception had always been spotty at best. Tommy stood there beside his dead truck, weighing his options. He could walk back toward town, but that was 5 miles in the dark. Or he could keep going toward home, which was still about 10 miles away. Neither option seemed appealing. Then he remembered there was a small gas station about 3 miles ahead. They'd have a phone he could use. He grabbed his jacket from the cab, locked up his truck, and started walking. The forest on either side of the road was thick with pine and oak trees. Their branches formed a canopy overhead that blocked out most of the moonlight. Tommy's flashlight cut a narrow path through the darkness as he walked. The only sounds were his footsteps on the gravel shoulder and the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere in the trees. He'd lived in this area his whole life and wasn't afraid of the dark or the woods. But there was something unsettling about being out here alone at night with no way to call for help. He'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when something caught his eye. There, just ahead on the left side of the road, the beam of his flashlight reflected off something metallic in the underbrush. At first, Tommy thought maybe someone had dumped an old appliance or piece of farm equipment. People did that sometimes, unfortunately. But as he got closer, he realized what he was seeing were tire tracks, and they were fairly fresh. The tracks led from the road straight into the forest, disappearing between the trees. Now, Tommy wasn't the nosy type. He generally believed in minding his own business. But something about those tracks bothered him. They were deep, suggesting a heavy vehicle, and the way they cut through the underbrush looked violent, like whoever had driven off the road hadn't meant to. Maybe someone had an accident and needed help. Tommy stood at the edge of the road, debating with himself. He was already in a bad situation with his own truck broken down. Did he really want to go wandering off into the dark forest? But what if someone was hurt? What if they'd been lying out there for hours, waiting for someone to find them? Tommy had a strong sense of what was right. And he knew he'd never forgive himself if someone was in trouble and he just walked past. He took a deep breath, checked that his flashlight had plenty of battery left, and stepped off the road into the forest. The tire tracks were easy enough to follow. Whatever vehicle had come through here had snapped branches and crushed undergrowth. Tommy moved carefully, watching where he stepped. The forest floor was covered in dead leaves and fallen branches that made it hard to walk quietly. Every few steps, something would crack under his boots, making him jump. He kept telling himself this was probably just someone who'd gone off-roading and gotten stuck. But his gut told him something else was going on. The tracks led him deeper into the woods, winding between trees and over small rises. Tommy had lost track of how far he'd walked. Maybe a quarter mile, maybe more. He was starting to think about turning back when his flashlight beam caught something big ahead, something white that didn't belong in the forest. He moved closer, his heart starting to beat faster, and that's when he saw it clearly. It was a truck. But not just any truck. This was a prison transport vehicle, the kind used to move inmates between facilities. Tommy had seen them on the highway before, usually traveling in pairs with police escorts. But this one was alone, hidden deep in the forest, sitting at an odd angle with one tire completely flat. The white paint was dirty and covered with moss in places, and pine needles had piled up on the hood. This thing had been here for a while. Tommy approached slowly, his mind racing with questions. What was a prison truck doing abandoned in the middle of the forest? Where were the guards? Where were the prisoners? The more he looked at it, the stranger everything seemed. The front bumper was damaged, like it had hit something hard. There were scratches along the side, deep ones that looked deliberate. And when he walked around to the back, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The rear doors, the ones that would have held the prisoner compartment, were secured with heavy chains and padlocks. Multiple chains, wrapped around the handles and through the door frames. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make sure those doors stayed shut, but why? If this was an official prison vehicle that had broken down or been abandoned, wouldn't the authorities have come to retrieve it? And why chain the doors from the outside? Tommy stood there staring at those chains, and every instinct in his body was screaming at him to turn around and get out of there. This wasn't right. Nothing about this situation was right. But at the same time, he couldn't just walk away. What if there was someone inside? What if prisoners had been locked in there and forgotten? The thought made him sick to his stomach. He walked back around to the front of the truck, his flashlight beam sweeping across the windshield. There was a bullet hole in the glass. Tommy stopped dead in his tracks. A bullet hole. The glass was cracked in a spiderweb pattern around a small round hole on the driver's side. His hand started to shake a little as he reached for the door handle. The driver's door wasn't locked. It swung open with a loud creak that echoed through the quiet forest. Tommy shined his light inside and felt his stomach drop. The cabin was a mess. Papers were scattered everywhere, covering the seats and floor. There was something dark stained on the steering wheel that looked disturbingly like dried blood. A crusty coffee cup sat in the holder, green mold growing inside it, and there on the dashboard was more of that dark staining, leading from the bullet hole in the windshield down to the seat. Tommy's first instinct was to back away and run. Every horror movie he'd ever seen told him this was a very bad place to be. But he forced himself to stay calm and look more carefully. He needed to understand what had happened here. Using just the tips of his fingers, trying not to disturb anything, he picked up one of the papers from the passenger seat. It was an official transport document, dated 3 months earlier in August. It listed a transfer of 4 inmates from a county jail to a maximum security prison about 200 miles north. 3 of the names on the list had been crossed out with red ink, heavy lines that almost tore through the paper. But the 4th name had a circle around it, and next to it, someone had written one word in capital letters. Escaped. Tommy read that word 3 times, his mind trying to process what it meant. An escaped prisoner from this truck 3 months ago. And nobody knew about it? He set the paper down carefully and kept searching. Wedged between the seats, half hidden by a torn map, he found a guard's badge. The metal was tarnished, but the ID number was still visible. Next to it was an empty gun holster, the leather cracked and dry. Tommy's hands were definitely shaking now. This wasn't just an abandoned vehicle. This was a crime scene. Something terrible had happened here, and for some reason, it had been left hidden in these woods where no one would ever find it. Unless someone's truck broke down at exactly the right spot on exactly the right night, and that person decided to follow some tire tracks into the forest instead of minding their own business. Tommy stood there in the dark cabin of that prison truck, the beam of his flashlight making strange shadows dance across the blood-stained interior, and he realized his quiet Thursday evening had just become something much more complicated. The walk back to his truck felt longer than Tommy remembered. Every shadow seemed threatening now, every sound in the forest made him jump. He kept his flashlight moving, sweeping it back and forth. Across the trees, half expecting to see someone watching him from the darkness. The whole situation had transformed from curious to genuinely frightening, and he was starting to question whether he should be doing this at all. When he finally made it back to the road, his own truck sitting there exactly where he'd left it, felt like a small miracle of normalcy. Tommy retrieved his tire iron from behind the seat and stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool night air, gathering his courage. He could just walk away. He could head toward that gas station, call the police, and let them handle all of this. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But then he thought about those chains again, about how deliberately they'd been placed. Someone wanted to keep whatever was in that truck contained or hidden, and the more Tommy thought about it, the more he realized that if he walked away now, he might never know the truth. The police would come, sure, but would they tell him what they found? Would they even believe his story? Without seeing what was in the back of that transport, he'd always wonder. Tommy tightened his grip on the tire iron and headed back into the forest. This time he knew the way and he moved faster, following the path he'd already cleared through the underbrush. The beam of his flashlight found the white prison truck exactly where he'd left it, still and silent in the darkness. It looked almost ominous now, like some kind of metal tomb. He went straight to the back doors and studied the chains more carefully. They were secured with heavy padlocks, the kind that would normally require bolt cutters to remove. But Tommy noticed that the chains themselves were wrapped around the door handles, and the handles looked older, maybe not as strong as the chains themselves. If he could break or bend the handles, the chains might come loose. Tommy wedged the flat end of the tire iron under one of the door handles and pulled with all his weight. Nothing happened at first. He adjusted his position, got better leverage, and pulled again. This time he felt something give slightly. The metal of the handle was starting to bend. He worked at it for several minutes, pulling and prying, the muscles in his arms and back burning with the effort. Sweat dripped down his face despite the cool night air. Finally, with a loud crack that echoed through the forest, the handle broke free. The chain holding it fell away with a clatter. Tommy moved to the other side and repeated the process. This handle was even rustier and came loose more easily. Within 20 minutes, he had all 3 chains lying on the ground and the rear doors were ready to open. Tommy stood there catching his breath, staring at those doors. This was it. Whatever was behind them, he was about to find out. He grabbed the right side door and pulled. It was stuck, probably from months of sitting in the damp forest air. He pulled harder, putting his whole body into it, and suddenly the door flew open, nearly knocking him over. A wave of stale, rotten air rushed out, making him gag and step back. He covered his nose and mouth with his sleeve and shined his flashlight inside. The back compartment of the truck was divided into 4 separate cells, just like he'd expected. Metal benches, metal walls, metal bars. It looked exactly like a mobile prison should look. But it was what was inside those cells that made Tommy's heart pound in his chest. 3 of the 4 cells were completely empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of everything. No belongings, no trash, nothing to suggest anyone had ever been in them. But the 4th cell, the one on the far right, was different. Tommy climbed up into the truck, moving carefully, and approached that cell. The door of the cell was standing open, hanging loose on its hinges. Inside, there was a prison jumpsuit crumpled in the corner, the orange fabric stained and dirty. Scattered across the metal bench were playing cards, maybe 20 or 30 of them, spread out like someone had been in the middle of a game. And on the walls, scratched into the metal with something sharp, were marks, tally marks. Groups of 5 scratches crossed through by a diagonal line the way prisoners mark days in movies. Tommy counted them. 47 marks. 47 days. Someone had been locked in this cell for almost 7 weeks after whatever happened during that transport. The realization hit Tommy like a punch to the gut. One of the prisoners hadn't escaped. One of them had been kept here, trapped in this truck in the middle of the forest for over a month. But where was that person now? Were they dead? Had they starved? Or had they finally gotten free? Tommy's flashlight beam moved across the cell looking for more clues. There were empty water bottles on the floor, maybe a dozen of them. And there were food wrappers, the kind you'd get from convenience stores. Someone had been bringing supplies to whoever was locked in here. This wasn't random. This was intentional imprisonment. On the metal bench, partially hidden under the playing cards, Tommy spotted something else. A small notebook similar to the guard's log he'd found in the cabin, but with a different cover. He picked it up carefully and opened it. The pages were filled with writing, and not the neat handwriting of an official log. This was messy, desperate, with words crossed out and rewritten, the handwriting of someone under extreme stress. Tommy started reading from the first page, and what he found made his blood run cold. Day 1. They shot Richards. I saw it happen. We crashed, and they dragged us out. Rodriguez tried to fight, but there were too many. They shot him too. I thought I was next, but they put me in here instead. The prisoners, they took 3 of them, but left me. I don't know why. I can hear them outside sometimes, talking. They're arguing about what to do with me. Tommy flipped through more pages. The entries continued. Day 5, still here. They bring me food and water once a day. I tried to talk to them, tried to ask what they want, but they won't answer. One of them, the tall one with the scar, he just stares at me through the bars. Makes me sick to my stomach. Day 12, I heard them mention something about waiting. Waiting for what? I don't understand any of this. If they wanted to kill me, they would have done it already. Are they holding me for ransom? But I'm just a prison guard. Nobody's going to pay to get me back. Day 19, the thin one brought me food today. He looked nervous. He kept looking over his shoulder like he was afraid of being caught. When he handed me the water bottle through the bars, he said something I didn't catch at first. Then he said it again, "You saw too much. That's all." Then he left. Day 27, I think I understand now. During the attack, I saw their faces. All of them. If they let me go, I could identify them. But they can't bring themselves to kill me either, so they're keeping me here trying to decide. One of them wants to let me go far away, somewhere I'd never come back from. Another wants to finish it. They argue about it almost every night now. Day 35, haven't seen anyone in 3 days. No food, water's almost gone. Are they leaving me here to die? Is that their solution? Let nature do what they couldn't? The entries became shorter after that, harder to read. The handwriting got shakier, the words less coherent. Day 40. So thirsty. Please God, anyone help. Day 43. Found a loose bar. Working on it when I have strength. Little bit each day. Day 47. Bar is loose enough. Tonight. I'm getting out tonight or dying here. That was the last entry. Tommy closed the notebook and stood there in the prison cell, trying to process everything he'd just read. One of the guards had survived the initial attack but had been imprisoned here as a witness. Kept alive but locked away while his captors debated what to do with him, and after 47 days he'd finally managed to work a bar loose and escape. Tommy looked at the cell door again. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see that one of the bars had been bent slightly, just enough for a desperate person to squeeze through. So the guard had gotten out of the cell. But had he gotten away? Or was he still out here in this forest somewhere? Tommy climbed back down from the truck and swept his flashlight around the immediate area. For the first time, he looked for signs of a trail leading away from the vehicle, and there, on the far side of the clearing, he found it. Disturbed leaves, broken branches, the unmistakable signs of someone moving through the underbrush. The trail led away from the truck deeper into the forest. Every instinct Tommy had told him not to follow that trail. He'd found enough already. More than enough. The smart thing would be to get out of here right now and call for help. But something drove him forward. Maybe it was the thought of that guard, surviving 47 days of imprisonment only to die lost in these woods. Maybe it was the need to see this through to the end, whatever that end might be. Tommy followed the trail. It wasn't easy to track in the darkness, and several times he lost it completely and had to backtrack to find it again. The person who'd made this trail had been weak, stumbling. There were places where it looked like they'd fallen and crawled for a few feet before getting back up. Tommy's heart ached thinking about what this person had gone through. The trail led him about 200 yards from the truck, winding between trees and over rough ground, and then Tommy's flashlight beam caught something that made him freeze in his tracks. There was a depression in the ground ahead, roughly rectangular, covered with branches and leaves. Someone had tried to hide it, but time and weather had partially exposed it. It looked exactly like what Tommy feared it was. A grave. His hands were shaking as he approached it. He didn't want to look, didn't want to know, but he had to. Using his boot, he carefully pushed aside some of the covering branches. And there, in the beam of his flashlight, he saw fabric. Orange fabric. A prison jumpsuit. Tommy's mind raced. So one of the prisoners was buried here. But which one and why? He thought back to the transport document in the cabin. The names crossed out and that one circled with "escaped" written next to it. Nothing about this made sense. If the attackers had freed the prisoners, why would one be buried here? If they'd killed them, why take 3 and bury 1? He was so focused on the grave that he almost didn't hear it. A soft sound from somewhere behind him. A branch breaking. A footstep. Tommy spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and that's when his heart nearly stopped. There was someone standing at the edge of his light, just barely visible. A figure watching him. Tommy opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The figure took a step forward, emerging more clearly into the light. It was a man, thin and disheveled, with a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in months. He was wearing torn, dirty clothes that might have once been a guard's uniform, and he was holding something in his hand, something that caught the light and gleamed. A knife. The man stared at Tommy with wild, frightened eyes. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough and cracked, like he hadn't used it in a long time. "Who are you?" he asked. "How did you find this place?" Tommy realized with a jolt of understanding that he was looking at the guard who'd written that notebook, the man who'd been imprisoned for 47 days. He'd escaped, but he'd never left the forest. He'd been out here all this time, surviving somehow, hiding, and now Tommy had stumbled right into whatever nightmare this man was living. "I'm not with them," Tommy said quickly, raising his hands to show he wasn't armed. "My truck broke down. I just found this place by accident. I'm not gonna hurt you." The man's eyes darted around frantically like he was expecting others to appear from the shadows. "They come back sometimes," he whispered. "To check, to make sure everything's still hidden. You need to leave. You need to leave right now before they find you here too." But even as he said it, Tommy heard something else. The sound of an engine, distant but getting closer. A vehicle coming through the forest. Coming toward them. The sound of the approaching engine sent a spike of pure terror through Tommy's chest. He looked at the disheveled guard, whose face had gone pale in the flashlight beam. The man's grip tightened on the knife he was holding, and his whole body tensed like a rabbit about to bolt. "Turn off your light," the guard hissed urgently. "Turn it off now!" Tommy fumbled with his flashlight and clicked it off, plunging them both into darkness. The sudden absence of light was disorienting. Tommy couldn't see his hand in front of his face, but he could hear everything with crystal clarity. The engine was getting louder, definitely coming their way, and there was more than one vehicle now. He could distinguish at least 2 different engine sounds, maybe 3. The guard grabbed Tommy's arm in the darkness, his grip surprisingly strong for someone who looked half-starved. "Come with me," he whispered. "Stay quiet. Follow exactly where I step." They moved through the forest in complete darkness, the guard leading Tommy by the arm. Tommy had no idea how the man could see where he was going, but he seemed to navigate the terrain with practiced ease, avoiding obstacles and moving with barely a sound. They'd been walking for maybe 2 minutes when the guard pulled Tommy down behind a fallen log and held a finger to his lips, even though Tommy could barely see the gesture. The vehicles were very close now. Tommy could see lights flickering through the trees, headlight beams cutting through the darkness. They were heading straight for where the prison truck was hidden. The engines cut off and Tommy heard doors opening and closing. Voices drifted through the night air, men talking in low tones. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was casual, almost bored. These people weren't afraid. They came here regularly. They check every week or so. The guard whispered directly into Tommy's ear, his voice so quiet Tommy could barely hear it. "Make sure nobody's found it. Make sure I'm still gone. They've been doing it for months." Tommy's mind was racing. He needed to get out of here, needed to get to a phone and call the police. But these men were between him and the road, between him and any hope of escape, and he had no idea how many of them there were or what kind of weapons they might be carrying. The guard had survived out here for months by staying hidden. Maybe that was the only option right now. They stayed frozen behind that log for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. The men walked around the prison truck, their flashlight beams sweeping across it. One of them said something that made the others laugh. Then they seemed to have a conversation, though Tommy still couldn't make out specific words. Finally, the engine started up again and the vehicles began to leave. Tommy started to stand up, but the guard pulled him back down. "Wait," he breathed. They sometimes leave someone behind, to watch just in case, so they waited longer. Tommy's legs were cramping from crouching behind the log, and he was acutely aware of every small sound in the forest. An owl hooted somewhere above them. Small animals rustled in the underbrush. The wind moved through the trees with a sound like distant ocean waves. And through it all, Tommy strained his ears for any sign of another person nearby. After another 10 minutes, the guard finally relaxed slightly. "Okay," he whispered, "but we need to move away from here. They're gone, but they'll come back. They always come back." They stood up slowly, Tommy's joints protesting. The guard turned on a small penlight, keeping the beam pointed down at the ground and cupped with his hand so it wouldn't be visible from a distance. In the dim red glow that filtered through his fingers, Tommy could see the man's face more clearly. He looked much older than he probably was. His eyes had a haunted quality, like he'd seen things that had fundamentally changed him. "There's a place I've been staying," the guard said quietly. "It's not far. We can talk there." They walked for maybe 15 minutes, moving deeper into the forest, away from both the prison truck and the road. Tommy realized with growing unease that he was getting more and more lost. He'd never find his way back without this man's help. But what choice did he have? Those men might still be out there watching. The guard's place turned out to be a small cave formed by an overhang of rock, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, hidden from casual view, was a makeshift camp. A sleeping bag that looked like it had been stolen from somewhere, empty food containers carefully stacked in one corner, water bottles, a small camping stove, and most surprisingly, a battery-powered lantern. The guard turned on the lantern, keeping it dim. In the soft light, Tommy could see more details of the cave. There were papers tacked to the rock walls covered in notes and drawings. Names, dates, descriptions. The guard had been documenting everything he'd seen and remembered. "You want to know what happened?" the guard said. It wasn't a question. He sat down on a flat rock and gestured for Tommy to sit on another. 3 months ago, I was just doing my job. Regular transport run. Nothing special. Me and Richards, we'd done it dozens of times before. Tommy sat down, his body tense and ready to run if needed. But something about the man's voice, the exhaustion and pain in it, made him want to listen. "The 4 prisoners we were transporting," the guard continued. "We didn't know it at the time, but one of them wasn't supposed to be with us. He'd been swapped in at the last minute. Someone on the inside, someone with access to the system, had arranged for him to be on that truck." "Why?" Tommy asked. The guard's face twisted into something between a grimace and a bitter smile. "Because he had information. This prisoner, he'd been part of a major robbery operation. Millions of dollars stolen from an underground casino. The kind that does business with dangerous people. When he got caught, he made a deal. Said he'd testify, tell the feds where the money was hidden, name everyone involved, in exchange for witness protection and a reduced sentence." Tommy was starting to understand, but someone didn't want him to testify. Exactly. The people he was going to testify against, they found out about the transport. They planned the whole thing. Followed us, forced us off the main highway onto back roads. Then they ambushed us. The guard's voice cracked slightly. Richards, he tried to fight back. Drew his weapon. They shot him 3 times before he even got a round off. Rodriguez, the other guard, he surrendered immediately. Put his hands up. "They shot him anyway. And you?" I saw their faces. All of them. Clear as day. That was my mistake. If I just kept my head down, maybe they would have let me go. But I looked up, made eye contact with the leader, and I saw the decision happen in his eyes. I was a witness. I could identify them. So they couldn't let me walk away. The guard pulled a water bottle from his stash and took a long drink before continuing. They took 3 of the prisoners out of the truck and drove off with them. But the 4th one, the one who was going to testify, they shot him right there, killed him and buried him in that grave you found. That's what the whole thing was about. They made it look like an escape so nobody would look too hard for the body. "But they kept you alive," Tommy said. "Yeah, they locked me back in the cell and argued about what to do with me. Some wanted to kill me right away. Others said it was too risky, that a missing guard would draw attention. They kept bringing it up, kept debating. Days turned into weeks. I think eventually they just forgot about me. Or maybe they were waiting for me to die on my own so they wouldn't have to make the decision." "How did you get out?" The guard held up his hands. His fingers were scarred and bloody, even months later. Worked on one of the bars every day. Little bit at a time. Used a piece of metal I'd torn from the bench. It took almost 7 weeks, but I finally got it loose enough to squeeze through. "And you've been out here ever since? Why didn't you go for help?" The guard's expression darkened. "Because I don't know who to trust. Those men, they knew about the transport. They knew the route, the timing, everything. That means they had someone on the inside, someone in law enforcement or the prison system. If I go to the wrong person, I'm dead. They'll find me and finish what they started." Tommy felt a chill run down his spine. The guard was right to be paranoid. Someone with inside access had set this whole thing up. Going to the authorities could be walking straight into a trap. "But we have to do something," Tommy said. "We can't just hide out here forever. There has to be someone we can trust." "Like who?" "The local police? For all I know, the sheriff himself could be involved." "The FBI? How do we contact them without going through local channels first? And even if we could, what proof do I have? It's been 3 months. Any evidence on that truck is long gone or degraded. It's my word against whoever's paying these guys." Tommy thought about the camera he'd found in the cabin, the photos of the white sedan and the men following them. He thought about the guard's notebook and duty log. He thought about the grave and the body in it. "There's evidence," he said. "I found a camera in the truck. And your logbook. And there's the body. That's proof. The guard looked up sharply. The camera? It's still there? In the cabin. I saw it. For the first time, something like hope flickered across the guard's face. Then it died just as quickly. Even if we can get the camera, how do we get it to someone who can actually do something with it? The moment we walk out of these woods, we're targets. Tommy pulled out his cell phone. No signal, just like before. But that gave him an idea. My truck broke down on the main road, he said. That's how I found this place. If we can get back to it, get it running, we could drive straight to the state capitol, go directly to the state police headquarters, walk in the front door where there are cameras and witnesses. They couldn't touch us there. Can you fix your truck? Maybe. Probably. I just need to figure out what's wrong with it. The guard was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Tommy could see the debate happening behind his eyes. Stay hidden and alive but trapped forever in these woods? Or take a risk, trust someone for the first time in months, and maybe, just maybe, get justice for Richards and Rodriguez and that murdered prisoner? There's one more thing you should know, the guard said finally. The leader of the group, the one who planned all this. I got a good look at him. He had a very distinctive scar across his jaw, and he was wearing a ring. A gold ring with what looked like a police academy insignia on it. Tommy's stomach dropped. You think he was a cop? Was or is?
I don't know.
But that ring wasn't fake. And the way he organized everything, the way the others followed his orders, he had training, professional training. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of that revelation hanging between them. Then Tommy stood up. We need to get that camera, and any other evidence we can carry, and then we need to get out of these woods before those men come back. The guard looked at Tommy for a long moment and slowly nodded. They waited until the early hours of the morning before making their move. The guard, whose name Tommy finally learned was Vincent, said the men rarely came back twice in the same night. It was as safe a time as any to approach the prison truck again. Moving through the dark forest was easier with Vincent leading the way. The man had spent 3 months learning every tree, every rock, every possible path through these woods. He moved silently, confidently, and Tommy did his best to follow without making too much noise. The temperature had dropped, and Tommy's breath came out in small white puffs that disappeared into the darkness. When they reached the clearing where the prison truck sat, Vincent held up a hand, signaling Tommy to stop. They waited and listened. The forest was quiet except for the normal sounds of night creatures and wind through branches. No engines, no voices, no flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Quick, Vincent whispered. Get what we need and get out. Tommy approached the cabin while Vincent kept watch. He climbed into the driver's seat and found the camera exactly where he'd left it on the dashboard. He checked the battery. It was nearly dead, but hopefully it would last long enough. He also grabbed the guard's duty log and the transport documents, shoving them into his jacket pockets. Then, on impulse, he took the badge he'd found wedged between the seats. That might be important, too. Vincent appeared at the cabin door. We should take photos of the back compartment, he said. And the grave. Everything we can document. They spent the next 10 minutes photographing everything using the camera Tommy had found. The tally marks on the cell wall. The scattered playing cards. The broken bar Vincent had used to escape. Then they carefully made their way to the grave site. Tommy took photos of the disturbed earth and the visible orange fabric, making sure to get shots from multiple angles that showed the location relative to the truck. What about the body? Tommy asked quietly. Should we? Vincent shook his head firmly. No, we don't touch it. That's for the authorities to do properly. We just document that it's here. With their evidence collected, they began the careful journey back to where Tommy's truck was still sitting on the side of the road. It took them nearly an hour of walking through the forest in the dark. Tommy was exhausted, running on adrenaline and fear. Every snap of a branch made his heart race. Every shadow looked like it might be someone watching them. When they finally reached the road and Tommy saw his truck, he felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made his knees buckle. But the relief was short-lived. Now came the hard part, getting the truck running. Tommy popped the hood while Vincent kept watch from the edge of the trees, unwilling to stand exposed on the road. In the beam of his flashlight, Tommy started checking everything systematically. Alternator, battery connections, fuel lines, spark plugs. It took him 20 frustrating minutes before he found the problem. The fuel pump relay had failed. It was a small component, but critical. Without it, the fuel pump wouldn't engage and the engine wouldn't start. Can you fix it? Vincent called out quietly from his hiding spot. Tommy thought about it. He didn't have a replacement relay with him, but he did have some wire and tools in his truck box. He might be able to bypass the relay temporarily, just enough to get the engine running. It wasn't pretty and it wasn't safe for long-term driving, but it might get them to the state capitol. He worked by flashlight, his cold fingers fumbling with small wires. Twice he had to stop and warm his hands by breathing on them. But finally, after what felt like forever, he had a bypass wired in place. He slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life. Tommy could have cried with relief. He leaned out the window and called to Vincent. "We're good, come on." Vincent emerged from the trees and ran to the truck, moving faster than Tommy would have thought possible for someone in his condition. He jumped into the passenger seat and Tommy immediately put the truck in gear. They pulled onto the road and started driving. For the first few miles, neither of them spoke. Tommy kept checking his mirrors, expecting to see headlights following them. But the road behind them stayed dark. Beside him, Vincent sat rigid, his hands gripping the door handle like he might need to jump out at any moment. "How far to the Capitol?" Vincent asked finally. "About 90 miles. 2 hours if traffic's light. We should get there around sunrise." Vincent nodded but didn't relax. They might have people watching the highways. "Looking for me. You really think they've been searching for you all this time? I think they can't afford not to. I'm the one person who can identify them, who can testify about what really happened. Until I'm dead or they're in prison, neither of us is safe." Tommy thought about that as he drove. He thought about his normal life, his repair shop, his quiet existence. 24 hours ago, his biggest worry had been fixing Mrs. Henderson's brakes. Now he was driving through the night with a man who'd been held prisoner for months, carrying evidence of murder and corruption, possibly being hunted by criminals who might include law enforcement. They'd been driving for about 40 minutes when Tommy spotted headlights behind them. Far back, but definitely there, his heart started pounding. "Vincent," he said quietly, "we've got company." Vincent turned in his seat and looked back. His face went pale. "Speed up. See if they follow." Tommy pressed the accelerator and his truck picked up speed. The headlights behind them got brighter. Closer, they were definitely following. "How far to the next town?" Vincent asked, his voice tight with tension. "Maybe 10 miles. There's a truck stop there. Lots of people, lights, witnesses. Head for it. Stay on public roads. Don't let them get us somewhere isolated." Tommy pushed his truck as fast as he dared on the winding road. The vehicle behind them matched their speed, staying about a quarter-mile back. Not closing in, but not falling back either. Just following, watching. The 10 miles felt like 100. Tommy's hands were sweating on the steering wheel, his eyes constantly flicking between the road ahead and the mirror showing those persistent headlights behind them. Beside him, Vincent had pulled out his knife and was holding it in his lap, for all the good it would do against whatever might be coming. Finally, blessedly, Tommy saw lights ahead. The truck stop, exactly where he remembered it. Bright fluorescent lights illuminating rows of gas pumps and a large parking lot full of semi-trucks. Tommy pulled into the lot and drove straight to the most crowded area, parking between 2 big rigs where they'd be surrounded by people and activity. The vehicle that had been following them slowed as it approached the truck stop, then drove past without stopping. It was a dark SUV with tinted windows. Tommy couldn't see who was inside, but he didn't need to. The message was clear. "We know where you are." "We're watching. We can't stay here long," Vincent said. "But we need to be smart about the next move." Tommy looked around the truck stop. There were people everywhere. Truck drivers grabbing coffee, travelers fueling up, workers starting early morning shifts, witnesses, safety in numbers. And there, on the far side of the parking lot, was a state police cruiser. An officer stood beside it, filling his coffee cup from a thermos. Tommy made a decision. "Come with me," he said to Vincent. They got out of the truck and walked across the parking lot toward the police cruiser. The officer looked up as they approached, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt, toward his weapon. "Officer," Tommy said, keeping his hands visible and his voice calm, "my name is Tommy Briggs. This is Vincent Torres. He's a corrections officer who was reported missing 3 months ago. We need your help, but we need to be very careful about who we trust." The state police officer's expression shifted from caution to confusion to intense interest. Vincent Torres? You're the guard from the missing transport? You know about it? Vincent asked, surprised. Know about it? It's been a major investigation. 2 guards dead, 4 prisoners missing, and you vanished. Everyone thought you were dead too. Tommy pulled the camera from his jacket. We have evidence. Photos, documents, everything. But we think there are people in law enforcement involved. We need to get to someone high up. Someone we can absolutely trust. The officer looked between them, then at the camera, then back at his cruiser. Tommy could see him making calculations, trying to decide if this was real or some kind of setup. Finally, the officer reached for his radio. This is Unit 47. I need to speak directly to Captain Morrison at State Headquarters. Tell her it's urgent. Tell her it's about the Torres case. Within minutes, the parking lot was swarming with state police vehicles. Vincent and Tommy were separated, not arrested, but secured for their own protection. The camera and documents were carefully taken as evidence. And Vincent, for the first time in 3 months, was surrounded by people who believed him and wanted to help. The next few hours were a blur of interviews, statements, and medical exams. Vincent was taken to a hospital under heavy guard. Tommy gave his statement multiple times to multiple investigators, walking them through everything from his truck breaking down to finding the prison transport to meeting Vincent in the woods. The photos on the camera were exactly what they needed. Clear images of the white sedan following the transport, shots of the men inside, their faces visible, and most importantly, one photo that caught the leader's face in profile, showing the distinctive scar along his jaw. Within hours, facial recognition software had identified him. He was a former detective from a neighboring county who'd been fired 5 years ago for corruption, but had maintained contacts in law enforcement. A task force was assembled. The FBI got involved because it crossed state lines and involved federal witnesses. Using the information Vincent provided and the evidence Tommy had documented, they tracked down the white sedan to a chop shop. They found the 3 surviving prisoners in hiding, and under pressure and promised leniency, they talked. They named everyone involved. The arrest happened fast. The former detective and 5 others, including 1 current police officer who'd provided inside information about the transport. They recovered most of the stolen money from the casino robbery. And in the grave Tommy had found, they recovered the body of the prisoner who'd been murdered to prevent his testimony. The story made national news. Guard survives 90 days in forest after transport ambush. Mechanic's broken truck leads to major corruption case. The headlines were everywhere for weeks. Tommy returned to his quiet life, though it wasn't quite as quiet anymore. The repair shop got more business than he could handle, with people coming from all over just to meet the man who'd saved Vincent Torres. He hired an assistant to help with the workload and bought a new truck, though he couldn't bring himself to get rid of the old one. It had, after all, saved a man's life by breaking down in exactly the right place. Vincent spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from malnutrition and exposure, then another month in protective custody during the trials. When it was all over, when all 6 men had been convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms, Vincent came to visit Tommy at his shop. I never properly thanked you, Vincent said, standing in the doorway looking healthier and more solid than the skeletal figure Tommy had first met in the forest. You could have walked away. You could have just called the police and let them handle it, but you didn't. You came looking for answers, and you believed me when I needed someone to believe me. Tommy wiped his greasy hands on a rag and shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. You survived on your own for 3 months. All I did was help you get out of the woods. You did more than that. You gave me my life back. They shook hands, and Vincent handed Tommy an envelope. Inside was a check, a reward from the recovery of the stolen casino money. It was more money than Tommy had ever seen at one time. I can't accept this, Tommy said, trying to hand it back. You can and you will. Besides, I got the same amount. They calculated it based on our role in recovering the money. Fair's fair. Tommy looked at the check, then at Vincent, then laughed. It was a sound of relief and release, of tension finally breaking after months of wait. Vincent laughed too, and for a moment they were just 2 men who'd survived something impossible and come out the other side. Vincent went on to write a book about his experience, which became a bestseller. He used the money to start a foundation that helped families of law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty. Tommy donated half his reward to that foundation and used the rest to expand his shop. Sometimes, late at night when the shop was closed and Tommy was alone, He'd think about that Thursday evening when his truck broke down. He'd think about the choice he made to follow those tire tracks into the forest instead of just walking to the gas station. How different everything would have been if he'd made a different choice. Vincent would likely still be out there hiding and slowly wasting away. The murdered prisoner would never have been found. The corrupt cops would still be free. But Tommy had followed his instinct, had trusted his gut that something was wrong and needed to be made right. And in doing so, he'd changed everything. Not just for Vincent, but for the families of the murdered guards, for the justice system that caught the corrupt officers, and for himself. He'd discovered that sometimes the most important thing you can do is pay attention when something doesn't seem right, and have the courage to do something about it. His truck was never the same after that jury-rigged fuel pump bypass, but Tommy kept it running. It sat in the corner of his lot, a reminder that sometimes breaking down in the right place at the right time can change everything. And every time he looked at it, he remembered that cold November night. The forest, the hidden prison truck, and the man who refused to give up hope even after 90 days of imprisonment. Some people said Tommy was a hero. He never saw it that way. He was just a mechanic who fixed things, whether they were cars or injustices. And on that particular night, what needed fixing found him in exactly the right moment. The forest still stands on the edge of town, and somewhere deep in those woods, hidden from casual view, is the clearing where an abandoned prison truck sat for 3 months. The authorities eventually removed it as evidence, but the clearing remains. And if you know where to look, you can still see the tire tracks that led a curious mechanic to discover a truth that needed to be told.